Welcome. I'm super excited to just be here and discuss all these different things that I have the opportunity of discovering as I wander through life. I know sometimes, as you guys know, it's me, Anthony Brown, aka the Ghetto Practitioner, and I'm always discovering different things as it cross my path. And one of the most recent discoveries I had was this book. This book. And it's really fascinating. It's called The Addictaholic Deconstructed. And I read this book and I'm like, well, that's very interesting. And I wanted to know more about it. And it was written by this young lady named Dr. Nicole Labor. And so I went and through, a few connections of mine, I discovered this wonderful lady, and I wanted to bring her on to talk to you more about addiction. So I will let her introduce herself, and without further ado, Dr. Labor.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me here. So I am Nicole Labor. I am a board certified family medicine and addiction medicine physician, and I am also in recovery from addiction for the past 20 years. So I work in the field, I live in the field, my entire world is immersed in addiction. And it's been my life's purpose to try to reduce the stigma around addiction by breaking it down in like easy bite-sized pieces for people to understand and digest and get a grasp on, because it has such a moral, ethical connotation to it that really is not, it's not part of real addiction. Real addiction has to do with the brain and the way that it, becomes defective. And so I've just kind of spent my life treating patients, educating patients, educating family and community. And so that's what I did. So I wrote The Addictaholic Deconstructed to deconstruct the brain chemistry and what is happening to try and help people really have a better idea about what's going on.
Okay, and that's fascinating. And you said you've been in recovery for over 20 years. Now, what I find fascinating is a lot of times people who hear the word recovery, that puts up a flag. 'Cause I know I myself, I work in the healthcare field. I focus more on the mental health issues and things of that nature. And I too am in recovery for, the past 26 years. And it's interesting because before I got into recovery, people would say, well, why don't you just stop what you're doing? Why are you behaving like this? Don't you think you have a better life? And when someone comes to not just you from your experience, but from you working with different clients. Have you ever heard that question? Somebody asked a client, how come they don't stop? Or, what would be your answer to a question like that?
So I get the question a lot, and I actually get it even now on like social media platforms where people essentially come in and say, addiction is just a choice and people can just choose to stop using if they want to. And so my response is generally this. I don't want to say it's my belief, but my research into the topic has revealed to me this idea that while a lot of people are able to use substances, even problematically, even for a really long time, even with consequences, about 80% of those people will at some point be able to stop using. They'll be able to make the choice, use their willpower and just stop. And they're the reason that I think everyone thinks that that's how it should go. But there is 20% of that group that while they're actively using or even prior to their use because of trauma history or whatever, they have a conformational change that happens in their brain, which makes it very, very difficult for them to access like the willpower or strength or whatever you want to call it cognitively that people use to just stop. And for that 20%, they will over and over try to stop and be unsuccessful. And then they get riddled with guilt and shame because what is wrong with me? Why could they do it and I can't do it? And so that causes a downward spiral because, again, part of the addiction process is the use of substances to cope with guilt and shame. So they continue to use, and they can't stop without reaching out for help. And so for those people, it's a brain disease. There's dysfunction. We can see it. It's on brain scans. You can see it in their behavior and their inability to stop. Because the truth is, when you get to the point where you're hurting people, you're hurting yourself, you're hurting people you love, you're hurting relationships, why would anyone choose to continue to do that? Like, they wouldn't. There has to be something wrong. And we know there is. We can see it. So that's what I say. 20% of all people who use substances are unable to stop on their own, and for them it's not a choice and it's not a matter of just stopping.
Okay, and that's fascinating, because you said something about something related to, okay, you're able to see this stuff on the scan and those 20% of people. Now, I love speaking with professionals. And what I have learned from your book and from what we discussed before, you're able to break that the professional language down to something where someone who's not professional can understand this. And when you said that there's 20%, it's a brain disease, can we dive into that a little bit? But what do you mean by a brain disease?
So just like any other disease, right, in order to qualify, we basically have to say there's something defective happening. There's something broken in order for it to be a disease. And then you have symptoms, right? And the symptoms for most people are the behavioral things, the things we see, right? The behaviors that people with addiction engage in. So what is the defect? What's broken? And it is multifactorial. It is more complex than I present it. But I think for the sake of people just everywhere, there's two parts of the brain that really are very strongly involved. We're talking about the primitive midbrain, right? The part of the brain where we have survival and reward. And then we have the frontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that, like, where our personality, that's where choice and willpower and skill building and all of that is happening. And in addiction, we see both of these areas become dysfunctional. So in the reward center, we see this downregulation or this taking away of dopamine receptors. So dopamine receptors go away. We need more dopamine, which is our pleasure chemical. We need more of it to feel kind of normal. And, you know, we all get dopamine from things like winning the lottery or falling in love or getting married or having a baby or, like, you know, good things. We all get a bunch of dopamine from that. But it's a natural amount of dopamine released. When we use chemicals, highly rewarding chemicals, we get a ton of dopamine dumped into that area. And our brain responds in that 20% by taking away some dopamine receptors. Because it's like, whoa, we've got all this dopamine flooding into the area. I don't need to keep all these receptors hanging around. So it pulls them away. So now you need more dopamine molecules in order to kind of saturate those receptors that are left. So for people with true addiction, they need high-level dopamine just to kind of feel normal. So that's defective. We can see a downregulation of dopamine receptors on a brain scan. On the flip side, in the cortex, what's happening is whenever we practice any skill over and over and over, we kind of wire a path or a highway through our cortex. So if you pick up an instrument and you practice the instrument over and over and over, you're building this highway of being able to play that instrument. And when we practice a skill to manage our emotions, we wire a highway or build a highway through that area. So when I pick up a drug and I use the drug and my brain realizes this manages my emotion, this takes away the sadness, or it gets rid of the, you know, anger, or it enhances the happiness or celebration or whatever, my brain goes, oh, that's very efficient. And we start using substances over and over to modify, change, fix all the things, right? We want to go from A to B. So if I use a substance to do that, I'm going to quickly get from A to B. So my brain starts wiring or building this highway that says substances are the solution to go from A to B. And when I have this really efficient highway, my brain's not going to spend any time and energy building a new highway. So I'm going to consistently want to jump back on that old highway. And of course, since now that's the only way I get enough dopamine that my reward center goes, oh yes, I want to do this. The two of them are working in conjunction to essentially make sure that that's the only way that my brain is able to process life and emotions and situations.
Okay, and so it's the dopamine that's the problem.
It is primarily the dopamine that is a problem. We don't have enough receptors left when we keep using. Yeah.
Okay, and so we run out of dopamine receptors, and we want more dopamine because there's nothing to satisfy because the receptors are not there. Am I on the right page?
Yep.
Okay, and so while this is going on, and we want, and what does dopamine do for us?
Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that our brain actually makes that drives us to seek pleasure, joy, happiness, things that feel good. Dopamine drives us to seek good things, but it also drives us to avoid uncomfortable or distressful things. So it's the molecule that keeps us happy.
Okay. And so we want to feel pleasure. We want to feel good. And no matter what we do, we don't have the receptor to do that. And so we try to get that same feeling by a behavior that we learned somewhere.
Yes.
Okay. And so this is why someone would go out and get into difficult situations or risk in order to feel good because they're trying to stimulate more of the dopamine, but there's no receptor to make you feel better.
So the brain recognizes that we need. So all right, let's think of it this way.
Okay.
Your reward center, your midbrain is a baseball field, and you have, let's say, 100 players on that field. They're packed in, and they've all got mitts. Those are your dopamine receptors. If you play the guitar or you do something natural, and maybe 20 dopamine molecules get thrown into that field. You need 10 of those players to catch a ball in order for your brain to go, I like this, I want to do this again. Okay? So let's say you pick up crocheting and you start to crochet and you don't like it. You only dump 8 balls into that field. It's impossible for your brain to get pleasure from that because you couldn't get the 10 players to catch a ball.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I get you.
So when you start using substances, highly rewarding substances, you dump 200 balls into the field. So all the players are catching balls. And the manager of the team goes, this is costing too much money. I'm not going to pay salaries on 100 players when 200 balls are falling into this field every 10 minutes. So he starts pulling players off the field. So now, after time of using, you have 10 players left on the field. And they're few and far between. So now, when you pick up your instrument or your baseball or your crochet or whatever you liked before, you're still only dumping 20 balls into that field. Well, the players are too far few and far between to be able to get all 10 players to catch a ball before they get sucked back out. Okay? So those activities are no longer enjoyable, which means that the brain is just in this state of constant dysphoria or blah, not like a rainy fucking Saturday. I hate, blah. So your brain will start to seek dopamine in a level where all 10 players can catch a ball. So it will drive you, because it is part of our survival mechanism, it will drive us to do whatever we have to do in order to get those balls. And so that's why we start doing things like violating our core values and behaving in a way that's counterintuitive to what we know is right, in order to get what we need.
Oh, okay. And so, and this is why it's considered a brain disease?
Yes.
Okay, and so if it's a disease, then why is there a stigma associated with addiction, do you think?
Well, I think there's still a lot of people that don't understand the brain concept, the brain disease concept. And of course there's always critics, because like science is not a permanent event. Science is ever evolving, ever changing. Right now, all of the science supports that this is a brain disease. We can see it. We have evidence of it. We know that if we treat it in a way that's acting like it's a disease, that seems to work. That seems to be effective. So that's kind of, the current body of evidence supports that. But I just think that like the brain is so complicated, and people don't understand anything about how the brain works. And so you have the average Joe out there kind of thinking like, well, you have control of your behaviors. You're in control of everything you do, without understanding the electrical and chemical processes that are happening in the brain for every behavior. So I think that it's a hard concept to understand. I think that people really struggle with understanding. But you tell them there's a tumor somewhere in the brain and that's causing someone to act differently. They seem to grasp that. So that's kind of the direction I try to go when I'm explaining it to people. But I just think that it's a lot of, and then again, you have that 80% of people who were able to kind of just stop. And they may really they're very loud about, I just put it down and I just stopped using, and you just have to use willpower and be strong. And, they kind of are a very loud voice that supports this idea that it's not a brain disease, that it's a choice.
Okay, and I understand that, because I know over in the mental health field, we know what causes depression, and it's because of the lack of serotonin and things of that nature. And a lot of times it takes us forever to get someone to understand that there's a mental illness going on. It's a brain disease that's going on because of the lack of this. And I'm grateful to cross paths with someone who can take all of that complex information, because it is complicated, and to speak to just a person who doesn't have a science background and that may fall into that 80% either side, whether it's addiction or mental health, and try to explain it. It can be challenging and difficult. And at times it can be frustrating. And so you being out there in the field, how do you deal with having to explain to a person who's addicted or a relative? What keeps you from being frustrated throughout your course of work?
Oh, I'm frustrated on a regular basis. It is very frustrating. I think just repetition and understanding that people don't know what they don't know. And we're so immersed in this field that a lot of times what we're telling people seems so like second nature, like, oh, this is just common sense. You should just understand this concept, and just remembering that, no, that's not true. Like, I remember when my stepfather was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, my mother and him, I was like, oh, well, you just got to do this and eat this and da-da-da. And they were like, what? We don't. And I'm like, well, how do you not know this? Like, everybody knows this, but they didn't. So people don't know what they don't know. And so I have to constantly keep that in my brain and try to remember that each time. But one of the things that I do is like write the book and do podcasts and do videos and social media to try and like repetitively get this information out there to help as many people as possible, which cuts down on some of my frustration, because I have a lot of patients that walk in the door and sit down and say, I saw your video when I was in treatment and it was really helpful to me to understand my brain. So I don't have to go through the whole thing every time.
Okay. All right. And thank you. I appreciate that. Now, I want to lean more back into the whole chemistry part of this. Okay. Now, you say it's a dopamine thing. Does that relate to all drugs or just specific drugs? Like, for instance, if somebody's doing methamphetamine, does it affect dopamine? Or if somebody's doing cocaine or heroin or alcohol even? Yep. Is it the same thing? Can you dive into that a little bit?
Sure. And this is probably the one area that I get the most pushback on. So dopamine is the chemical that our brain makes it. It makes dopamine and keeps it in a vesicle. And then when that brain cell gets activated, it dumps the dopamine into the reward center. So what causes that dopamine to be dumped in high quantity? So those are all of the drugs of addiction. So any drug that can cause people to start using that substance to the point of causing problems in their life. So yes, your cocaine, your amphetamines and methamphetamine, your opiates, alcohol for sure, barbiturates, sedatives, all the stimulants, marijuana, THC specifically, kratom, bath salts or cathionine, like all of the drugs, inhalants, the drugs that people use that can potentially cause addiction do release higher than normal amounts of dopamine into the reward center, which makes them all A, potentially problematic, and B, there's crossover, right? Because my brain doesn't know the difference between the dopamine that's released by cocaine and the dopamine that's released by heroin. It's the same dopamine. So my brain only knows it wants dopamine. And so if my, say, drug of choice is cocaine and I can't get it, my brain will say, well, then do that other one. Drink some alcohol, smoke some weed. Because my brain knows it's going to get that dopamine blast from those things. Even if my conscious experience with those drugs is negative. So even if I'm like, I don't really like those drugs, they make me feel down or up or something that I don't consciously like, my reward center, which is subconscious, gets that blast of dopamine. So my reward center likes all drugs. Everyone's does. So if you have this change where you don't have the dopamine receptors, any drug that dumps dopamine into that area is potentially problematic and will ultimately either lead to being a problem itself or lead you back to your drug of choice.
Okay. And so what about people who have like sex addiction, food addiction? Because I know people get some sort of reward from that. Is that the same concept?
It is the same concept, except for the behavioral addictions are very sort of genetically predetermined. So like if you are addicted to methamphetamine, you are basically automatically addicted to opiates, alcohol, all the other drugs. That's just because their crossover of drugs is the same. But for the behavioral addictions, you have to be genetically predisposed to getting a higher than normal amount of dopamine from that activity. So for example, when I gamble, I only get 20 molecules of dopamine. Most people do. But somebody who's predetermined to be or vulnerable to gambling addiction, they actually get 100 molecules of dopamine from gambling. So that person has potential to become addicted to gambling or sex or whatever the case is. So we all get 25, 30 molecules of dopamine from sex, but people who have an addiction to it get 90 to 150 molecules. And again, I'm simplifying the number. These are, super simple numbers. But yeah, so the behavioral addictions are very specific to people. And the best way to determine whether it's a problem is it causing a problem in your life? Whereas with the chemicals, ultimately we know that if you have a problem with one, you're going to wind up having a problem with the other one. There's a very high chance.
Okay. And I'm known to make simple things complicated. Okay. And then this intrigues me. And so what if someone's addicted to gambling, likes to drink, and do drugs? Will they have a longer time to recuperate, to feel normal than just somebody addicted to one substance?
Ultimately, if they stop all of the things that are releasing dopamine, no, it would take about the same amount of time. So, but the point of abstinence, or the point of stopping the constant release of high level dopamine, that's the point where healing starts. And at that point, the receptors can start to come back. And so, no, it doesn't matter. I mean, you could be addicted to all the things. But if you stop all of the things, the problem is most people don't. They'll stop one, or they'll stop two, or they'll pick up a new addiction, right? They'll start doing some food, right? I mean, high sugar, highly processed food, highly rewarding food. Some people, that's really problematic. So they stop doing drugs, they stop gambling, but now they're eating all the time. And so they start, having consequences from that. And so, but yes, if you were to stop everything and just start focusing on, how can I deal with life without all of that dopamine? The healing would start and the process would be the same for anybody.
Okay, great. And I know you mentioned the healing part, and you also mentioned the prefrontal cortex of your brain. Correct me if I'm wrong. You were referring to your brain had rewired itself to get rewarded so that it can get this dopamine somehow. Okay, and then you just mentioned the healing, and part of the healing. Do you mean that we have to abstain from the substance and increase our prefrontal activity to get that same dopamine or to get those receptors to come back?
Yeah. So abstinence, right, from highly rewarding substance will allow those dopamine receptors to come back. But if my prefrontal cortex believes that the only way for me to cope with a feeling or life is to use this highway of instant gratification, of high level dopamine, then even if I have all those receptors back and I'm not necessarily craving, right, the dopamine, I don't have another skill set to manage whatever's happening in my life. And so then I use the substance again, which blasts my baseball field with baseballs again. And then they immediately start pulling players again. So even if they all came back, they immediately start going away. So this is why things like prison for people with addiction, like incarceration or punishment, don't really work, because you're putting somebody in an isolated place where maybe they're not getting the dopamine, or let's say they choose not to use while they're in prison. We all know they could, but let's say they're choosing not to use, and so they are abstinent, so their receptors start coming back, but then they get no skill building. So when they get out of prison and they're out on the street and they go, I'm not using again, that got me, in jail, I'm not doing it again. But then they find out their, dog died or their spouse cheated or something happens, and they have no skill to deal with that. And so their brain immediately goes, oh, our skill is dopamine, we need dopamine. And so they jump back on that highway. And usually it's, oh, we'll go to the bar, I'll drink, at least I don't have a needle in my arm. Or, I'm going to smoke weed because at least I'm not smoking crack or whatever. But then that opens that highway back up as the coping skill, which then now that's the only highway the brain has. How am I going to deal with life? I'm going to use dopamine. So now if I'm drinking every other week to relax or unwind, or I'm smoking weed every day because work is stressful, that's my coping highway. Use a substance to cope. So now when something catastrophic happens in my life, the weed and the alcohol is not going to be enough. So my brain's going to go, well, where did we get more dopamine? Oh yeah, meth. Oh yeah, cocaine. Oh yeah, heroin, fentanyl, right? So that's the risk for relapse is so much higher when using kind of those lesser substances that weren't your drug of choice. It puts people at high risk, because again, the only way to sort of build new coping skills, to build a new highway, is to shut the old one down. Right? I'm not going to take back roads to the mall if there's a highway that gets me there in 5 minutes. So I need to build a new highway that gets me where I want to go. And the only way to do that is to practice a skill. And we have to practice it over and over and over. That's how we built the drug highway, was using over and over and over. So now we need to build a new, healthy habit highway to get from A to B and stay off of the original one.
Okay, I like that. The healthy habit highway, triple H. That's pretty good. Because again, like I said, I work in behavioral health, and I'm big on I'm big on. I have a philosophy. You don't think your way into better living. You live your way into better thinking. And you learn different things. You practice it. You get reinforced or rewarded for what you're doing. Then you continue to do it. And if you do it repeatedly, then from what I'm understanding, that helps with your dopamine so you can feel good. Sort of like getting high is a 30-watt light bulb, and I have to replace it with a 40-watt light bulb so that I can get a stronger charge that's going to eliminate that old highway.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but it's hard to do.
It is. Why do you think it's so hard?
Because you get such that instant reward, because the getting high gives you that sudden, intense, blast of dopamine. I would think about it like it's almost like a battle between the two parts of your brain, right? The subconscious part, which is your midbrain, where your dopamine is going. It's like this feral, intense beast going, we need the dopamine. And then you've got your frontal cortex, which is like cool, calm, and collected. Like, no. We need to figure out a better way. Let's weigh our pros and cons. Let's create a goal plan. Let's create some SMART goals and figure out how we're going to do this. And the two are battling. And it's like this, it just depends on which one you feed, right? So that's kind of what's going on in the brain. And so you need to consistently train and build up the troops for the frontal cortex in order to battle that midbrain.
Okay, and so, wow, fascinating. How long for the 80% that doesn't have the addiction and 20% that does? Is there ever a time when that 80 or someone from that 80% becomes that 20%?
Yeah. It can happen at any time. So we all have, like, 60% of us have some genetic vulnerability, right? And I've gotten some flack for this online for saying, like, genes cause addiction, and I never said genes cause addiction. But genes have to be present, and you have to have the vulnerability, and the gene has to be triggered or turned on to some degree in order for this process to start happening. Right? So if 60% of us have multiple genes that make us vulnerable to addiction, but we don't know what event or activity or substance or whatever is going to turn that gene on for us.
Okay.
Some people, it's one use, right? For some people, it's the first time they ever use a substance. That gene gets triggered and their brain immediately starts going, oh, and it just starts pulling dopamine receptors away. For other people, it may be 10 years of using before that happens. So if I were to take you and put you in a brain scanner today and say, nope, you still have all your dopamine receptors and your cortex seems to be relatively functional, but then tonight you go home and you use again, and that's the use that's going to trigger that gene, tomorrow your brain scan might look different. So there's really no way to know, which is why we treat the entire 100% as if they were the 20%. And you know what? If you're in the 80%, you come into treatment because the court tells you have to, and you go through IOP, and you go through counseling, and you go to your meetings and get your signed sheets or whatever, and then you walk out and you don't use again. You're like, I don't want those consequences. I'm not using again. And maybe you aren't truly addicted. Maybe you don't really have the disease. You think you do because you went through all the process and you're doing well and we think we did a good job. Nobody's hurt. It's fine, and you could have been at any point. You could convert over to that 20% of addicted people, but those are the people that have the disease of addiction. And I do wish that we could change the terminology, and nobody's asking me, but I do wish that. So we call it substance use disorder because it meets the criteria in the DSM, right, for mental illness. So it meets these criteria, and we say, oh, yes, you have substance use disorder, mild, moderate, severe. I think the 80% qualify for that. I think true addiction is the 20% that also qualify, but that will struggle more to get well.
That was deep. Dr. Labor, that was deep. I enjoy learning things. I enjoy understanding more about the addictive personality or the addictive process. And so when we talk about the different genes getting triggered, 60% of people probably is walking around with this gene inside their body. So it doesn't matter what age group you're in. I mean, you can go through your whole life until you get to your 60s, and all of a sudden, whammo, you're addicted.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep. So, but the rub for that is that if you make it to 60 without truly being addicted, you probably do have a good number of frontal cortex pathways or highways that help you deal with life without using. So for people that get addicted or become addicted later in life, they have a much higher chance of success in treating it because they're able to fall back on or strengthen old highways of coping. Whereas the people who started using as children or adolescents that maybe developed because of trauma, they don't have any old skill pathways. So their only skill is to use, and it's a lot harder for them to get well because they have to reconstruct entirely new highways.
Okay, and I heard you mention the word trauma several times. How does trauma, in your opinion, play into addiction?
To me, it's the same. So I think that there's when a certain percentage of the population experiences what their brain interprets as chronic and severe stress, so a traumatic event, they release a hormone called corticotropin releasing factor. Now, we all do to some extent, but some people genetically release more of it in times of trauma. And when you have high levels of CRF circulating in the brain responds by pulling players off your field in your reward center. It starts taking away dopamine receptors. And so people who experience trauma are predisposed to becoming addicted because they have no dopamine receptors. So they're walking around in life kind of dysthymic, just feeling like blah, like nothing really excites them. And then all of a sudden they get exposed to a highly rewarding chemical. So they have their first drink, or they smoke, a joint, or they even take cough medicine. I mean, they do something where their brain gets a little bit of a blast of dopamine and they go, oh, this is what it feels like to be normal. And so now they continue to seek out the substances that are going to make them feel that way. But then you have this cycle where when you start seeking out the substances all the time, you start doing things like violating your core values, right? The behaviors that people think are just choice. So you're lying, you're stealing, you're hurting people to get that dopamine blast. And now you feel guilty. And you feel ashamed because you know that those behaviors are wrong and you know that that's not the right thing to do. And when we feel shame, our brain interprets that as trauma. So our brain will release corticotropin releasing factor and cause the downregulation of dopamine receptors, which will then put us in a position of needing more dopamine. So now we'll violate the core values to get it, and it becomes this negative feedback loop, this vicious cycle. So trauma and addiction really look very, very similar in the brain.
Fascinating. And it's interesting because a lot of times we'll see someone, I know in my field, we'll see someone they appear to not have feelings, or they appear to not have any pleasure. And the very first thing we think, oh, you're depressed. Let me give you some antidepressant, you'll feel better. And we know antidepressants work on a whole different chemical. And so how do you, I know this is probably a silly question, but there's no such thing as a silly question. How do you deal with the dual diagnosis, someone that has depression and yet addiction, and it's a chemical thing? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So I think that it's really important to try and tease out the two pieces. So typically I'll talk to people like, if you have a history of depression or depression-like symptoms prior to ever touching a substance, then there probably is some serotonin and norepinephrine deficiencies. And so using the antidepressants or anxiolytics to try and help someone regulate that part can be helpful, with the understanding that if they're in early recovery, meaning the first year of abstinence or whatever, they're likely to have dopamine depression as well. So you're not going to get it 100% right. Using the SSRIs and SNRIs are not going to necessarily bring that person to fully functional non-depressive state, but it may help regulate to some degree. The problem that we wind up seeing is that everybody in early recovery should look a little depressed, right? Because they have no dopamine receptors. Right. So they can't experience joy and pleasure from normal things. So, they have to we almost have to force feed previously pleasurable things into their lives. So what did you used to like to do? Oh, I like to play the guitar. Okay, I need you to do that a lot. Even if you don't enjoy it, I need you to do it a lot, because that's going to force feed the most natural dopamine, the largest amount of natural dopamine, because you used to enjoy it. So we know that your brain gets pleasure from that. You find purpose, right? Finding purpose, serving others, that is huge amounts of natural dopamine. So force feeding yourself those things will kind of start the process of bringing receptors back. But in the meantime, can we potentially overshoot on the serotonin to see if we can at least maybe meet somewhere in the middle, right? So you have no dopamine, you have a normal amount of serotonin, but maybe if we give you a bit more serotonin, we can bring you up a little bit while we're waiting for that dopamine to come up. But with the understanding that at some point we have to readdress it. Like, we can't just willy-nilly stay on Zoloft at this dose forever, right? Because now we may have too much serotonin. So, so I think that it requires like a really careful and skilled practitioner to address both, right? And I'm talking mostly about like depression, anxiety, fairly stable mood disorder, obviously. I'm not talking about psychosis and things like that. Those are different animal.
Right. Okay, fascinating, because I know I'm always get asked that question. It's like, okay, just make me feel better, give me something. I feel depressed. And I explain to people, well, maybe because you've been drinking and using for 20 years, your body has to heal. And I agree, and I'm glad and appreciate that you nailed that one part, that instant gratification gives you that instant hyper boost. And that's what people are looking for instead of waiting forever to learn how to play an instrument. That makes a lot of sense. Fascinating. Okay, well, I'm glad we got a lot of information. I want to move on to what made you write this book. This book, The Addictaholic Deconstructed, and a irreverently quick and dirty education by a doctor who says, ooh, a lot. Tell me about it. What made you come up with this?
So when I first started practicing addiction medicine, I was in a hospital system, and they would ask me all the time to do like education lectures for like residents or nurses or whatever. And they would give me a topic. Can you talk about stimulants? Can you talk about opiates or whatever? So I would create a presentation and talk about it. And at the end of the talk, people would ask questions, and the questions were always evidence that people don't understand addiction at all. Like, they just didn't get the brain concepts. And so I spent a lot of the Q&A time talking about these concepts. And so I decided to create this lecture called Addiction 101. And I based it a lot on Dr. Kevin McCauley's Pleasure Unwoven series, his dopamine series, right? Brilliant doctor, brilliant man, really nice guy too. So I based a lot of that Addiction 101 on that. And I gave that lecture a couple times, and it was so well received that people kept asking me to do it. And then someone recorded it and put it on YouTube. And then people were watching it and reaching out and saying, can you come talk to our hospital? Can you come talk to my residents? Can you come talk to our church? And so all of a sudden I'm getting inundated with these requests to do this lecture. And it's evolving over time, right? There's more information, new information, better ways, better analogies. And so it's evolving. It got to the point where I was being asked to leave the state and go to other institutions and give this lecture, and that was pulling me away from my family and patients. And so I thought, what if I just write it down? What if I just take this lecture and I write it down? And not only that, but I can put in pieces of my story, which people are always fascinated about, which is so strange to me, but they always want little pieces of my story. So the book allowed me to essentially just dictate the lecture that I give with some, tangents that I usually don't have the time to go on when I'm actually lecturing, and give pieces and examples from my own story that kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. And so that was how the book came about. And, I think that I'm pretty widely known for just being very direct, very forthright, no holds barred, and I definitely have a potty mouth, and I don't have a filter. And so the irreverently quick and dirty education by a doctor who says a lot, that was pretty authentic to me. So I felt like that, I don't know, and I do feel like that pulls people in a little bit more, because there is this oh, you're a practitioner, it's going to be clinical, it's going to be hard to understand, it's going to be, That just, I feel like, makes it a little bit more relatable for people, because the book was never intended for professionals. It was intended for families and addicts and, some professionals for sure, but, communities at large.
Okay, yeah, and it's fascinating because it sort of aligns with when I wrote the book From Park Bench to Park Avenue. People heard me share how I came from being homeless for 23 years and now I'm a nurse practitioner, and it's like, how'd you do it? You know,
Yes.
and I shared it so many times, and someone said, well, why don't you just write a book about it? And I wrote a book, and it went out there. And it's really fascinating how there's different ways, or we try as healthcare professionals, we want to reach people. We want to help. That's why we're in this profession. It's not, I mean, it'd be great. If I could make $1 bazillion, I'd be happy, but I'm not going to make $1 bazillion. But if I can change your life, that allows that person to be functioning again, that's where I get my reward. And by writing this book, at least someone gets an idea that change can happen when I wrote From Park Bench to Park Avenue. And so having that, where can I get this? I mean, I know where I can get it because I have it. Now, where can a person get this book from?
Anywhere that books are sold. So it is on Amazon for sure, but I'm pretty sure if you did like Walmart or BarnesandNoble.com online, it should be in most local libraries, and you can always request that a library get a copy of it. It's on Audible, it's on Kindle. So yeah, I mean, you can get it pretty much anywhere books are sold now. Yeah.
Okay, and then we're getting close to wrapping up time. I spent years in California, years. And I've sat down with different professionals in the field, spoke a few times with Dr. Drew about addiction and homelessness and things of that nature. And I know how to get a hold of him. If someone wanted for you to come and do a talk, a lecture, a seminar, a workshop, or anything regarding your profession, because you definitely are an expert in the field, how could they get a hold of you?
So I have a website, theaddictsdoc.com. You can email me at theaddictsdoc@gmail.com. And then I am on social media. I'm on Facebook as The Addiction Assassin. I'm on TikTok as The Addicts Doc. I think I'm The Addicts Doc on Instagram. So, and I'm pretty responsive to all of those. So people can just because I'm not an influencer yet, so I still can access my DMs and answer emails and things like that. So yeah, I'm pretty easy to get a hold of that way.
Okay, and in case somebody missed it, can you tell us again how we can get a hold of you?
Yeah. So theaddictsdoc.com, TheAddicts doc.com. That's the website. That same moniker, theaddictsdoc@gmail.com, is a good email. And then I am on social media. So Nicole Labor Addiction Assassin is my Facebook moniker, and then The Addicts Doc on TikTok and Instagram.
Great, I love The Addiction Assassin.
So I always say that I'm the addiction assassin when I'm breaking down stigma, and I'm the addiction architect when I'm building people up and building programs.
Woo! Great. Love it, love it, love it. Well, folks, I could go on and on and on and on and on for hours in this conversation. It's intriguing, and it's a privilege for me to be able to sit with Dr. Nicole Labor and discuss in depth about addiction. I hope that we were able to answer a lot of questions out there. If you out there listening didn't quite get what you want, or you feel that you want more, reach out to us over here, and we'll be more than happy to give you directions, give you some insight. This is just great. And again, don't forget to get the book. Look for it all over the place. I have read it. I recommend it. And for those who wish to continue to understand, learn more, and especially get help with addiction, reach out and get some help. It's never too late to start your life over and continue to be prosperous. And so until next time, this is me, Anthony Brown, a.k.a. the Ghetto Practitioner, and I will see you all the next time. Until then, stay safe.
Thanks, Anthony. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.